Hello and welcome back. Today we're going straight into the first installment of the Lord of the Rings series. I'm going to begin by reading a quote from Tolkien himself. I cordially dislike allegory in all of its manifestations, and have always done so since I grown old and weary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed dominion of the author. I believe that any interpretation of Lord of the Rings is incomplete without this quote. There is not a one-to-one interpretation that is solely correct with his work here. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look at his work through an allegorical lens. It means that there isn't a story meant to explain precise meaning or history. With Oppenheimer being back in the collective social consciousness, I think it would be important to point that out, seeing as how these books were written during the Second World War. It allows the reader to interpret this book in a number of ways, and is really fascinating to see what people come up with this book. That being said, there seems to be a lot of connection to Christianity in The Lord of the Rings. When I was preparing this series, many people had made connections that I didn't even realize while reading the book. One of my favorite examples of this is the characters Gandalf, Frodo, and Aragorn. They all hold distinct aspects of Christ, and they all have an allegorical death. Several motifs are mercy, humility's victory over pride, and even baptism. For those who know the story fairly well, I'd encourage you to do additional research, and I'll link a Wikipedia article down below as a starting point, and it's really all just fascinating stuff to me. Today, we'll begin with the first poem in the book, one that most would recognize from the beginning of the movie as well. 3 rings for the Elven-kings under the sky, 7 for the Dwarf-lords in their halls of stone, 9 for the mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark-lord on his dark throne. In the Land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them. In the Land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. For those who are not familiar with the story, Sauron forged what is called the One Ring. His plan was to use it for power and dominion over all. The basic plot of the story is that the ring is found by creatures named hobbits, and as the story progresses, it becomes clear that the ring must be destroyed in the fires in which it was forged. The ring itself has several powers. The most obvious is invisibility to the one who actively wears it. It also holds untold power and dominion over the other wearers of their respective rings. It also seems to tempt and corrupt those who are around the ring to take it for themselves. What could the one ring to rule them all represent? I searched online to see what other people said about it. The most common answer was pure evil, which I do think that is accurate. Other people mentioned power, corruption, sin, addiction, greed, temptation, war, the atomic bomb, and slavery. I think all of those explanations are valid in their own way, and I'll include some of those in my own explanation today as well. I'm going to take a reading from Judges chapter 2. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for the Israelites, the Lord was with him and saved the people from the power of their enemies while the judge was still alive. The Lord was moved to pity whenever they groaned because of those who were oppressing and afflicting them. Whenever the judge died, the Israelites would act even more corruptly than their ancestors, following other gods to serve them and bow in worship to them. They did not turn from their evil practices or their obstinate ways. Judges chapter 2 summarizes that period of history so well, and this is a pattern of how things ended up after Joshua and Moses. We have a nation of Israel who, depending on what translation you use, continually does what is right in their own eyes, or doing what is evil in the Lord's sight. A judge would arrive, rescue the nation, and yet at the end of each period they were worse off after the judge passed away, turning into a gradual downward spiral. And then they would be rescued by the next judge. And so it was throughout the entire judge's period. They were unfaithful and got progressively worse. Eventually, we find ourselves in 1 Samuel chapter 8, after Samuel's sons became judges in Israel. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us the same as all other nations have." When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand wrong, so he prayed to the Lord. But the Lord told him, "Listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you what they have done to me, since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. Listen to them, but solemnly warn them and tell them about the customary rights of the king who will reign over them." I want to pause the reading here for a moment. Throughout the entire history of Israel since they left Egypt up until this point, they continually choose to reject God. It wasn't that having a king was immoral, it was that they were rejecting God as king. And that is key to understanding Israel's disobedience. What's going to be offered here is a choice for Israel. Follow a path of dominion and bondage if they adopt to the monarchy, or rightfully place God in the proper place as king. The people chose yet again to reject God after Samuel warns them. Samuel told all the Lord's words to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These are the rights of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and put them to use in his chariots, on his horses, or running in front of his chariots. He can appoint them for his use as commanders of thousands or commanders of fifties, to plow his ground and reap his harvest, or to make his weapons of war and the equipment for his chariots. He could take your male servants, your female servants, your best cattle, and your donkeys, and use them for his work. He could take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves can become his servants. When that day comes, you will cry out because of the king you've chosen for yourselves, but the Lord won't answer you on that day." The people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we must have a king over us. Then we'll be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles." Samuel listened to all the people's words and then repeated them to the Lord. "Listen to them," the Lord told Samuel. "Appoint a king for them." Then Samuel told the men of Israel, "Each of you, go back to your city." We may hear all of this and have a very difficult time relating to why we would defer our pain so far into the future, why people would so willingly give up their freedom for bondage. And I think that is why the One Ring may help illustrate this idea. In the Middle-earth fantasy setting, the One Ring would hold dominion over the entire world should it fall into the wrong hands. But what exactly are the wrong hands? Many people in the books were tempted by the power of the ring. Some were tempted by the power to attempt to use it to fight evil. However, that is a tyrannical force in its own right. It becomes a quest to stamp out what we ourselves deem right or wrong. But how far is that really from doing what is right in our own eyes, or doing what is evil in the Lord's sight? If we don't have Jesus as king, we always have a chance to bring everything under our own dominion or risk being dominated by somebody else. I've always liked this thought experiment. I do think that it helps further illustrate this idea. What is the one thing that you would wish on your worst enemy? And it's simple. Grant them every single wish that they could ever want. With unlimited power and wealth, it would feel like every possibility was available to them. But eventually, and maybe even fairly quickly, they would realize that every ambition that they ever had was quenched, that they had every want tended to, and that there was absolutely nothing for them to look forward to. In a way, this seems to be the story of the Western world, where the quality of life is higher than at any point in human history, but we are a society that has lost God along the way. We have what we think we need, but we are spiritually dead. There is no limit, no guide path, and no goal. This is what people seem to want, but at the same time, it feels like something is deeply missing within Western society right now. Because of our opulence, because of our values that we develop in the absence of God, and because of our stubborn belief that we know more than we actually do, we end up deceiving ourselves. We develop beliefs that we fully buy into without thinking of the consequences of our actions, which could be expressed as if only. For our biblical example, if only we had a king. We might in hindsight see how foolish this is, but if we're really honest with ourselves, we have all done this at some point in our lives. If only we elect the right people. If only we have centralized power. If only we seize the means of production for ourselves. If only the older generations would adapt to the new ways of thinking. If only we could have passed this one bill. If only I were president of the United States. Even if we believe that we are right and have all the good intentions in the world, this is how tyranny can still sneak in. Having a king was a solution to the problem, but they presumed to know more than they actually knew. We should avoid making the same mistake. When we see God as king, and when we do center ourselves properly, then at that point we can begin to ask the same question again, but this time we can start to see God in it. If only we put God first, we would not want to go back to the tyranny of Egypt. If only we put God first, we would not want dominion over us other than God himself. If only we let God rule our lives, then we wouldn't have the need for tyrannical control. If only we respected God's law, we would know right and wrong and not be misled. My hope with this devotional is that it got people thinking about this more. From a bird's eye view, it really is difficult to relate to the Israelites here. But the reality is, we are more like them in this story than we think. To relate it to the Lord of the Rings one last time, if only we could see the promise offered by the ring as a falsehood, we could begin to see the truth, that we are not suited to have dominion over others, and that we can be servants for the one true God. Until next time, God bless and stay salty.